Welcome to Revenge Central. I hope you're doing well. Today I will read 11 crazy revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing, and let's get started with Story 1. A tow truck showed up at 6 in the morning and repossessed my car, a car I had finished paying off 11 months earlier, complete with a paid-in-full letter and a title sitting in my own filing cabinet because my former lender's system had never actually processed my final payment correctly and, instead of catching their own error, sold what they still believed was a defaulted loan to a debt collector who hired a repossession company to seize a vehicle that had been legally mine, free and clear, for the better part of a year. I want to walk through how this happened because I still find the sequence of institutional failures required to produce this outcome somewhat remarkable, in a bad way, given how many separate points along the way should have caught the error before it ever reached the stage of an actual truck showing up at my house. I'd financed the car through a regional credit union, made my final payment on schedule, and received, about 3 weeks later, a paid-in-full confirmation letter along with my actual vehicle title, released and mailed to me directly as the loan satisfaction, exactly the process you'd expect for a properly closed auto loan. I filed that letter and the title away, registered the vehicle in my state's system reflecting the lien release, and genuinely never thought about that loan again, for the better part of a year. What I did not know, and had no way to know, was that an internal processing error at the credit union, something involving what I later learned was a batch update failure during a system migration they'd undergone around that same time, meant that while I had received my paid-in-full letter and my title correctly, the credit union's own internal loan servicing system had never actually been updated to reflect the loan as closed, continuing instead to show it as active, with a small remaining balance that, due to a separate glitch, was never actually billing me, but was also never flagged as fully satisfied in their records either. A genuinely strange limbo state that apparently sat quietly in their system for months without triggering any of the normal delinquency notices or collection activity you'd expect if it had actually been treated as an unpaid, active loan the entire time. The credit union, at some point during a broader portfolio review or system cleanup, apparently identified this specific account as an old loan with no recent payment activity and, without anyone actually pulling and reviewing the account's complete history, including the paid-in-full letter and title release that had clearly been issued, sold the account to a debt collection agency as part of a bulk sale of what they believed to be delinquent, uncollected auto loans. A batch sale process that, from what my attorney later explained, often involves relatively limited individual account-level verification, precisely because it's structured as a bulk transaction covering potentially hundreds of accounts at once. The debt collection agency, having purchased what they believed was a legitimately defaulted loan, complete with a lien against my vehicle, proceeded through their own standard process for a defaulted auto loan, which included hiring a repossession company to recover the vehicle securing what they understood to be an unpaid debt. A process that, from their perspective, looked like an entirely routine, properly authorized repossession, since nothing in the paperwork they'd purchased indicated the loan had actually been satisfied in full nearly a year earlier. I want to describe the specific shock of that morning, hearing the tow truck outside, going out to find my car already being loaded, and being told by the driver that he was there to repossess the vehicle under an authorization from a company I had never heard of, for a loan I had paid off, and had physical documentation proving as much sitting inside my own house. The driver, to his credit, was not unreasonable about it once I explained the situation, and offered to go inside and get the actual paid-in-full letter and title, though he did note, honestly, that his instructions were to complete the repossession regardless, absent a specific stop order from the company that had hired him, meaning my documentation, real and accurate as it was, did not automatically stop what was already in motion that morning. I called the debt collection agency immediately, and this is where the situation became genuinely infuriating rather than just an unfortunate mix-up, since the representative I initially reached had no ability, or willingness, to immediately halt an in-progress repossession based purely on my verbal claim of having paid the loan off, a policy that, while frustrating in the moment, I do understand exists precisely because plenty of people in active default might claim exactly the same thing to try to stop a legitimate repossession, meaning the burden fell on me to actually provide documentation before anything would stop. Documentation that existed, but that I could not transmit fast enough to prevent the vehicle from actually being towed away that specific morning. My car was, in fact, physically repossessed and taken to a storage facility that morning, despite my having the actual proof of payment in hand, simply because the specific process required for stopping an in-progress repossession moved slower than the mechanical process of the tow itself. I want to be honest that this specific detail, having irrefutable proof and still not being able to stop the vehicle from being taken that day, was one of the more helpless feelings I've experienced as an adult. I spent that entire day on the phone, first faxing and emailing copies of my paid-in-full letter and title to the debt collection agency. Then, once I realized they were treating this as a dispute to be reviewed on their normal timeline rather than an emergency requiring immediate action, contacting the original credit union directly, since they were the actual source of the underlying error and the only party with the ability to definitively confirm from their own original records that this loan had in fact been paid in full and improperly sold as delinquent. The credit union's initial response, when I first reached them, was frustratingly slow to escalate. A frontline representative unable to immediately access or confirm the specific loan history I was describing, requiring escalation to a supervisor before anyone with the actual authority and system access to review my complete account history got involved. Once that escalation happened, though, and once someone actually pulled my complete loan file rather than just a current snapshot, the credit union's own representative confirmed, within about an hour, that my account showed a paid-in-full letter and title release having been issued nearly a year earlier, an internal confirmation that should have been enough, on its own, to immediately halt everything. I want to note that even with the credit union's own internal confirmation in hand, actually getting my car back required the credit union to formally contact the debt collection agency directly, credit union to debt collector, confirming the account had been sold in error and should never have been treated as an active, defaulted loan at all, since the debt collection agency, understandably from a liability standpoint, was not willing to simply release a repossessed vehicle based on my own claims alone, requiring that direct institutional confirmation from the original creditor before they'd act. That confirmation came through by early evening the same day, and my car was released from the storage facility the following morning, meaning I was without my vehicle for roughly 24 hours total, along with having to arrange alternate transportation for work and other obligations during that window, plus, notably, being charged an initial storage and repossession processing fee by the storage facility that I then had to separately fight to have waived given the circumstances, since storage facilities generally charge these fees regardless of the underlying repossession's legitimacy and require a separate release authorization from whoever hired them before waiving anything. Once my car was back, I retained a consumer rights attorney specifically to pursue accountability for what had happened, since a wrongful repossession, particularly one involving a documented, provable payoff that the original creditor's own error caused to be sold as a defaulted loan, generally implicates several layers of consumer protection law, including provisions in most states specifically addressing wrongful repossession liability, along with potential violations of fair debt collection practice standards on the part of the collection agency depending on exactly how they'd handled the dispute once I'd initially contacted them with my documentation. My attorney pursued claims against both the credit union for the underlying processing error that caused a paid-off loan to be sold as delinquent in the first place, and the debt collection agency for the specific handling of my dispute once notified, particularly regarding the delay between my initial documentation submission and the actual vehicle release, arguing that a debt collector receiving clear documentary evidence of a payoff has an obligation to act with reasonable urgency given the severe practical harm of being without your vehicle, rather than simply processing the dispute on a standard administrative timeline as if it were an ordinary payment amount disagreement, rather than an active, ongoing wrongful deprivation of property. The case resolved through a settlement covering the direct costs I'd incurred, alternate transportation, the storage fee I'd initially been charged, lost wages for time spent handling the situation during work hours, along with additional damages for the wrongful repossession itself, which our state's specific consumer protection framework around vehicle repossession treats as a meaningful, independently compensable harm beyond just the direct financial costs. Recognizing the genuine disruption and distress of having a vehicle wrongfully seized, even when the underlying error gets corrected within a day or two. I want to be honest that the thing that stays with me most is not any single institution's specific failure, but how many separate, independent checks, the credit union's own account review before a bulk sale, the debt collection agency's own verification before authorizing a repossession, could have caught this error at any point along the way, and simply didn't. Each institution apparently trusting the accuracy of records passed to it from the previous link in the chain rather than independently verifying anything against, for instance, the state's own vehicle title and lien record system, which would have shown, plainly, that the lien on my vehicle had been released nearly a year earlier, a detail that should have been a simple, definitive check available to anyone in that entire chain before ever dispatching a tow truck to my house. If you've ever paid off an auto loan, my honest, practical advice from having lived through this is to keep your paid-in-full letter and released title somewhere you can access instantly, not filed away and forgotten, but somewhere you could produce within minutes if you ever needed to. And to periodically, maybe once a year, actually check your state's vehicle title and lien record system directly to confirm the lien release is properly reflected there as well, not just trusting that a letter and a title in a folder somewhere means every downstream system that might someday reference that loan has been correctly and permanently updated to match. Story 2. I took a consumer DNA test purely out of curiosity about ancestry, agreed to a health traits add-on report mostly for fun, and 18 months later got denied a long-term care insurance policy, specifically because of a genetic marker flagged in an underwriting report that referenced information I had never disclosed to that insurer directly at all, which meant the only realistic explanation was that my genetic data had been sold or shared by the testing company to some data broker or underwriting information service in a way I had never knowingly consented to. I want to walk through how I got here, because I did read the terms and privacy policy when I signed up, or at least I believed I had read it carefully enough, and I think that's an important detail for anyone who assumes, the way I did, that scrolling through and clicking accept on a lengthy privacy policy document constitutes genuine informed understanding of everything a company might eventually do with your data. The testing company's core service was straightforward: ancestry composition, plus an optional health traits report covering things like certain hereditary disease markers and carrier status information. Presented as an add-on, I opted into specifically out of curiosity, since a family history of a couple of specific hereditary conditions made that information genuinely interesting to me personally, entirely separate from any practical purpose beyond satisfying my own curiosity. The company's privacy policy, which I did actually read at the time, included language about potentially sharing anonymized or aggregated data with research partners, standard enough sounding for a company that does genuinely fund some legitimate scientific research through exactly this kind of data sharing arrangement, and separately included an opt-in consent specifically for participating in research studies, which I recall declining at the time, believing that decline meant my specific individual data would not be shared with any outside party, beyond the company's own internal use for providing my results. The long-term care insurance application came up entirely unrelated to any of this, part of general financial planning my husband and I were doing in our early 50s, a standard, unremarkable process involving a health questionnaire and a request for authorization to obtain additional health-related information as part of underwriting, a standard authorization I signed without much scrutiny since it's a routine part of essentially any application for this type of insurance. The denial letter, when it arrived, was more specific than I expected an insurance denial to be, citing a specific genetic marker associated with elevated risk for a particular hereditary condition as a contributing factor in the underwriting decision, a level of specificity that immediately struck me as strange, since I had never disclosed any genetic testing information directly to this insurer, had never mentioned the consumer DNA test at all anywhere in my application, and had no family history of that specific condition that I was aware of being asked about or having disclosed in any of the standard health questionnaire sections. I requested the complete underwriting file the insurer had used to make this decision, which insurance applicants generally have a legal right to request under various state insurance regulations, and, in some cases, federal Fair Credit Reporting-related provisions, given that underwriting decisions often draw on third-party information sources similar in regulatory treatment to credit reporting. That file, once I received it, referenced a specific third-party health and genetic information reporting service I had never heard of and never directly interacted with, listing the specific genetic marker finding attributed to that service as a data source. I contacted that third-party reporting service directly, and, after a genuinely frustrating series of calls and written requests over several weeks, was eventually able to obtain, under provisions similar to credit reporting access rights that apply to certain categories of consumer reporting agencies, including specialized health and genetic information services, a copy of what they had on file regarding me. It showed genetic marker data that matched, in a way that seemed impossible to be coincidental, the exact specific health trait finding from my original consumer DNA test, meaning that data had, somewhere along the way, made it from the testing company into this specialized underwriting information services database, despite my having never directly interacted with or authorized data sharing with that service at all. I want to describe how frustrating and genuinely difficult it was to trace the actual mechanism connecting these two companies, since neither one, initially, was forthcoming about the specific pathway involved. It took a consumer privacy attorney, retained specifically for this purpose, sending formal legal demand letters to both companies requesting a complete accounting of any data sharing arrangements between them, to actually get a clear answer, which turned out to involve a research partnership the testing company had established with an academic institution, a partnership that, per the fine print in a research consent form I apparently had, in fact agreed to as part of a bundled consent process during account setup that I did not clearly remember specifically opting into as a standalone, clearly presented choice, separate from simply agreeing to the platform's general terms of service. That academic research partnership, according to what my attorney was eventually able to establish, had, in turn, licensed or shared certain aggregated and, critically, in some instances individually identifiable genetic data with commercial partners for what was described in secondary agreements as legitimate research and development purposes related to health risk modeling, a chain of secondary sharing that ultimately connected, through at least one additional intermediary, to the specific underwriting information service that had ended up with my specific genetic marker data on file and available for insurance underwriting purposes. This entire chain, once fully traced, represented, in my attorney's assessment, a likely violation of both the testing company's own stated privacy policy commitments regarding how individually identifiable genetic data would be used and shared, and potentially applicable state genetic privacy statutes, several states having enacted specific laws in recent years explicitly regulating genetic data privacy and prohibiting exactly this kind of downstream sharing or insurance underwriting use without clear, specific, standalone informed consent. Given how uniquely sensitive genetic information is compared to more ordinary consumer data categories, I filed a formal complaint with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division, specifically citing the state's genetic privacy statute, along with a complaint to the Federal Trade Commission regarding the testing company's data sharing practices relative to what its privacy policy had actually represented to consumers at the point of consent. And, separately, my attorney pursued a formal legal claim against both the testing company and the underwriting information service, arguing my genetic data had been used for insurance underwriting purposes without the kind of clear, specific, standalone consent that our state's genetic privacy law required for exactly this category of use. The case against the underwriting information service resolved first, through a settlement in which they agreed to remove my genetic marker data from their underwriting database entirely and to notify the insurer that had denied my application that the genetic information used in that underwriting decision should not have been included, which the insurer, once formally notified, used as grounds to reprocess my long-term care application without that specific genetic marker as a consideration. resulting in an approved policy at standard rates once the reassessment was completed. The case against the original testing company took considerably longer and was more legally complex, given the layered chain of research partnerships and secondary licensing agreements involved, but ultimately resolved through a settlement that included a payment to me, a formal acknowledgement that the specific consent flow used at account signup had not adequately distinguished standalone genetic data research sharing consent from general terms of service acceptance in a way our state's genetic privacy statute required, and, more broadly and meaningfully to me than my individual settlement, a requirement that the company revise its consent process going forward to require a clearly separate, standalone affirmative opt-in specifically for any research partnership data sharing involving individually identifiable genetic information, distinct from any bundled general terms of service acceptance. I don't know how many other customers of that same testing company had their genetic data flow through the same chain into the same or similar underwriting information services without ever realizing it, the way I only discovered through an insurance denial that happened to be specific enough in its stated reasoning to actually trace back, and that uncertainty, honestly, is one of the more unsettling lingering feelings I still carry from this entire experience. The sense that a huge number of people who took a curiosity-driven consumer DNA test years ago likely have no idea their genetic information may be sitting in a database used for insurance or other underwriting purposes they never meaningfully consented to. If you've taken a consumer genetic testing service at any point, I'd encourage actually going back and reviewing your account's specific data sharing and research participation settings directly within the platform, rather than assuming your original sign-up choices remain the definitive final word on how your data has been used since companies do sometimes update terms, introduce new partnership arrangements, or bundle consent in ways that are easy to miss. And I'd also encourage, if you're ever applying for any type of insurance that requires health-related underwriting, requesting the complete underwriting file used in any denial decision specifically, since that file, in my case, was the single document that actually revealed a data trail I otherwise would never have had any reason or ability to trace on my own. Story 3. My younger brother signed a rent-to-own contract for a living room set and a washer and dryer combo shortly after moving into his first apartment, needing furniture immediately and having no savings or credit history to buy anything outright. And by the time I actually sat down and did the math on what he'd agreed to, he was on track to pay just under $7,000 total for furniture and appliances that would have cost roughly $1,900 purchased outright at a normal retail price. A gap I only fully understood once I started pulling apart exactly how the contract's payment structure and fee stacking actually worked. I want to walk through the specific mechanics, because rent-to-own contracts are legal in every state, genuinely useful for some people in specific circumstances, and the difference between a reasonable arrangement and a predatory one often comes down to details buried in payment schedules and fee structures that are easy to miss when you're a 20-year-old signing paperwork at a store counter while excited about finally furnishing your own first apartment. My brother's contract structured payments weekly rather than monthly. $63 a week for the living room set and $41 a week for the washer and dryer. Numbers that, presented that way, sound genuinely manageable on an hourly wage, which is precisely the point of structuring payments this granular in the first place, since a weekly figure always looks smaller and more digestible than the equivalent monthly total, let alone the full contract term total would look, if presented plainly up front. The contract term for full ownership was 18 months for the furniture and 24 months for the appliances, and it was only once I actually multiplied those weekly payments out across the full contract term, $63 times roughly 78 weeks for the furniture, $41 times roughly 104 weeks for the appliances, that the real total became clear. Just under $7,000 combined, against a combined retail purchase price, which I confirmed by simply looking up the identical model numbers at several other retailers, of under $2,000, meaning my brother was on pace to pay close to 3.5 times retail value simply for the privilege of paying in small weekly installments rather than all at once or through a normal financing arrangement. I want to be clear that rent-to-own pricing structures being higher than outright cash purchase price is not by itself illegal or even necessarily predatory in every case, since these arrangements do provide real value to people with no credit history or savings who genuinely cannot access any other path to acquiring necessary furniture or appliances, and a reasonable premium for that flexibility and access is a legitimate business model. What actually made my brother's specific contract predatory, once I dug into the details with him and eventually with a consumer attorney, was a combination of several specific factors layered on top of the base pricing. First, the contract included a mandatory damage waiver fee, an additional weekly charge presented during signing as functionally required, despite technically being an optional add-on, covering accidental damage to the furniture during the rental period. A fee that added a meaningful percentage on top of the base weekly payments, and that my brother did not fully understand was optional rather than a mandatory part of the base contract, since the sales associate had presented it, according to my brother's clear recollection, as simply part of the standard package rather than a separate elective charge he could decline. Second, and this turned out to be the single most consequential detail, the contract included a provision stating that if any payment was missed, even by a single day, the entire accumulated equity toward eventual ownership reset to zero, meaning a customer who had faithfully paid for, say, 14 months of an 18-month term, and then missed one single weekly payment due to a rough week financially, would not simply owe that one missed payment plus a late fee, they would lose all credit toward ownership entirely, and effectively restart the clock from month one if they wanted to continue the arrangement, a structure that functions less like a normal installment purchase plan and more like restarting an entirely fresh rental relationship every time any hiccup occurred. My brother had, in fact, missed one payment several months into his contract, during a week where a car repair ate into money he'd normally have allocated to the furniture payment, and had not fully understood, until I actually read the contract with him afterward, that this single missed payment had reset his accumulated progress toward ownership entirely, meaning months of payments he'd already made had effectively purchased him nothing beyond continued use of the furniture during that period, rather than the ownership credit he'd reasonably believed he was steadily building. Once I understood the full scope of what he'd signed, I brought in a consumer protection attorney a friend had recommended, specifically to understand what regulatory protections, if any, applied to rent-to-own contracts in our state, since this is an area where consumer protection varies enormously by state. Some states regulate rent-to-own agreements fairly closely, capping total cost relative to retail value and requiring specific plain language disclosures about the true total cost of the contract, while other states have comparatively minimal specific regulation covering this exact category of transaction, treating it more like an ordinary rental agreement than a consumer credit product, despite functioning, in practical effect, much more like predatory installment lending. Our state, my attorney explained, fell somewhere in the middle, without a specific cost cap but with a requirement that rent-to-own contracts disclose the total cost of ownership in clear, itemized terms directly in the contract document itself, a disclosure requirement that, once we pulled my brother's actual signed contract and read through the full document rather than just the payment schedule he'd focused on at signing, appeared to have been technically present but presented in dense, small print language buried on a later page, in a format that, while arguably technically compliant with the letter of the disclosure requirement, seemed designed to minimize the likelihood a typical customer would actually notice and process that information clearly during a normal in-store signing process. My attorney's approach focused on that specific disclosure issue, arguing the contract's presentation of the total cost disclosure did not meet the spirit or reasonable practical standard of a clear and conspicuous disclosure requirement, combined with a separate argument regarding the equity reset provision, which she felt was arguably an unconscionable contract term under general consumer contract law principles, given how disproportionately harsh a consequence, complete loss of accumulated ownership credit, was relative to the actual harm caused by a single, brief, one-time late payment. We sent a formal demand letter to the rent-to-own company laying out both arguments, along with a request to renegotiate my brother's remaining contract terms to reflect his actual accumulated payments to date, crediting him properly for the months he'd already paid rather than treating his one missed payment as having erased that entire history. The company's response, notably, shifted from an initial boilerplate denial to a more accommodating negotiation, once our letter specifically referenced the disclosure clarity issue and cited language from our state's consumer protection statute governing rent-to-own contract disclosures, suggesting their own legal team recognized enough genuine risk in how that disclosure had actually been formatted and presented to prefer a negotiated resolution over defending the contract's specific presentation in any kind of formal proceeding. The resolution we reached restored my brother's accumulated payment credit from before the missed payment, adjusted his remaining balance to reflect that restored credit, and, notably, removed the mandatory in-practice damage waiver fee going forward, cutting his remaining weekly payments meaningfully and shortening his path to actual full ownership by several months compared to where the original contract terms would have left him. I want to be honest that my brother still ended up paying considerably more in total for that furniture and those appliances than he would have paid buying outright, even after this renegotiation, since the core premium built into rent-to-own pricing as a category remained largely intact. This specific fight was about correcting the equity reset penalty and the buried fee disclosure, not about eliminating the fundamentally higher cost structure inherent to this type of financing arrangement in the first place. If a friend or family member of yours is considering a rent-to-own arrangement, having no other realistic path to acquiring furniture or appliances they genuinely need, my honest advice is not necessarily to avoid the arrangement entirely, since sometimes it really is the only practically available option, but to specifically read, or better yet have someone else read with them, the complete contract before signing, particularly looking for exactly two things: the actual total cost figure compared plainly against a quick search of that same item's normal retail price, and the specific consequence described for a missed or late payment, since it was that second detail, buried and easy to overlook in the excitement of finally furnishing a first apartment, that turned my brother's otherwise survivable financial hiccup into months of lost payment credit before we caught and corrected it. Story 4. I bought a used SUV from a private seller who presented a clean title, a detailed maintenance history, and a completely plausible story about being the second owner after his mother, and within 4 months the transmission and half the electrical system started failing in ways that a mechanic eventually connected to flood damage, which led me down a genuinely infuriating path of discovering the vehicle's title had been laundered through 2 other states, specifically to strip its actual flood salvage history before it ever reached me. I want to explain the mechanism of title washing first, because it's a specific, known practice that I had no idea existed before this happened, and understanding it retroactively explained everything that had gone wrong with a car that looked, on paper and on a test drive, completely unremarkable and legitimate. When a vehicle sustains serious damage, flood damage specifically being the category relevant here, an insurance company that pays out a total loss claim on it typically brands that vehicle's title with a salvage or flood designation in whatever state the claim was processed, a permanent record intended to follow that vehicle forever and warn any future buyer of its history. Title washing exploits the fact that not every state's motor vehicle record system communicates that branded history equally well to every other state, meaning a vehicle branded as flood salvage in one state can sometimes be re-registered in a different state that either doesn't recognize that specific branding designation or has gaps in how thoroughly it checks incoming out-of-state title histories, resulting in a clean, unbranded title being issued in the new state despite the vehicle's actual documented flood history existing on record somewhere else entirely. I bought the SUV through a private sale listing, met the seller in person, test drove it, had it inspected by a general mechanic beforehand who found nothing alarming, checked the title itself, which was clean, no salvage or flood branding of any kind, and ran a standard vehicle history report through one of the common consumer services, which also came back showing no accident, salvage, or flood history at all. Everything about the transaction, at the time, felt like reasonable, standard due diligence for a private used car purchase. The problems started gradually, around month 3, an intermittent electrical issue with the dashboard display flickering, then progressed to the transmission developing a rough, delayed shift pattern that got noticeably worse over a couple of weeks. I brought it to a mechanic I trusted, describing the symptoms, and he flagged something during his diagnostic that made him ask a pointed question I hadn't expected: whether I knew anything about the vehicle's history with water exposure, since he was seeing a specific combination of corrosion patterns in wiring harness connectors and moisture staining in areas of the vehicle that, in his professional experience, were strongly associated with flood damage rather than any more ordinary mechanical wear pattern. That question sent me down a research path I genuinely hadn't anticipated needing to pursue for what I'd believed, based on a clean title and a clean history report, was a straightforward, honestly represented used vehicle purchase. I want to note something important here that I did not understand before this happened, which is that consumer vehicle history reports, while genuinely useful and generally reliable for a large percentage of vehicles, are only as complete as the data actually reported to them. And a title that has been successfully washed through the specific state-hopping process that strips its branded history at the state title issuance level will often show clean on these consumer reports too, since the report is drawing from the same underlying state title records that the washing process itself was specifically designed to manipulate. I paid for a more specialized vehicle history check through a service that specifically aggregates insurance industry total loss claim data directly, separate from the standard state title record-based reports, since insurance companies maintain their own shared database of total loss claims across the industry, specifically to combat exactly this kind of title washing, a database that exists independently of whatever a given state's title office ultimately decided to print on a subsequent registration. That specific check returned what the standard report had entirely missed: an insurance total loss claim filed against this exact vehicle's identification number several years earlier, citing flood damage, in a state completely different from where I'd purchased it, and different again from the state listed as the immediately prior registration on the title itself. Exactly the multi-state pattern consistent with a deliberate title washing operation rather than any innocent clerical gap. Armed with that insurance industry total loss record, which included a specific claim date, the flood damage designation, and the state where the original total loss determination had been made, I had something concrete and verifiable to pursue, rather than just a mechanic's informed suspicion, however credible that suspicion had been on its own. I want to be fair to the specific seller I'd bought the car from directly, because the investigation that followed, once I retained a consumer attorney with experience in vehicle fraud cases, ultimately suggested he was likely not the original architect of the title washing scheme himself, but rather someone who had purchased the vehicle from an intermediate seller specifically operating in the used car resale space, at a price that, in hindsight, had been slightly below typical market value in a way that, at the time, I'd simply attributed to a motivated private seller wanting a quick, hassle-free sale rather than any red flag about the vehicle's actual history. My attorney's investigation traced the vehicle's full title history across all 3 states involved, confirming the original flood total loss claim, then a subsequent registration in a second state under a salvage title designation, and finally, a third state registration where, for reasons that remained somewhat murky even after investigation, likely involving either a genuine gap in that state's cross-state title verification process or, potentially, some level of complicity from whoever processed that specific registration, the vehicle emerged with a clean, unbranded title that then made its way, through one more private sale, to the seller I'd ultimately purchased from. Given that my direct seller appeared to have relied on that clean title in good faith himself, my attorney's approach focused less on pursuing him personally for damages and more on pursuing the entity that had actually processed the third state registration removing the flood branding, since that specific transaction was the actual point where the fraud, whether deliberate or through gross negligence in verification, had occurred. This turned out to be a used car reseller, operating what my attorney's investigation characterized as a title washing operation at some scale, specializing in acquiring flood and salvage vehicles from insurance auctions in bulk, then processing them through registration in states with weaker cross-verification practices before reselling them at prices reflecting their apparent clean title status, capturing the difference between a salvage vehicle's actual depressed value and a falsely clean-titled vehicle's full market price as their profit margin. We filed a complaint with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division and, separately, with the State Motor Vehicle Department in the state where the improper clean title had actually been issued, providing the full insurance industry total loss record and the multi-state title history my attorney had assembled, specifically flagging the reseller entity involved as operating what appeared to be a title washing scheme at meaningful scale rather than a single isolated processing error. That combined regulatory attention, once it connected our specific complaint to what turned out to be a broader pattern the motor vehicle department in that state had already begun receiving other, similar complaints about regarding the same reseller entity, led to that entity's dealer license in that state being suspended pending a full investigation, and, separately, gave my attorney a considerably stronger negotiating position when pursuing a civil claim, since we were no longer arguing an isolated case but pointing to a documented pattern the state's own regulators were independently already investigating. That civil claim, pursued against the reseller entity directly rather than my immediate private seller, resulted in a settlement covering the vehicle's actual repair costs for the flood-related damage, once independently assessed by a certified mechanic specifically evaluating flood damage remediation, along with a partial refund reflecting the difference between what I'd paid believing the vehicle had a clean history and its actual fair value given the true flood salvage history that should have been disclosed and reflected in its title from the very beginning. I want to be honest that the repaired vehicle, even after the electrical and transmission issues were properly addressed, has never fully restored my confidence in it, and I ultimately sold it, at a loss, within about a year of finally getting it properly repaired, choosing to simply be done with the entire situation, rather than continue driving a vehicle I now associated primarily with months of stress and an unsettling window into how easily a genuinely serious, safety-relevant history can be effectively erased through nothing more than moving a title through the right sequence of states. If you're buying a used vehicle privately, especially one that's changed hands or registration states more than once in its recent history, I'd strongly encourage paying for a specialized insurance industry total loss database check specifically, rather than relying solely on a standard consumer vehicle history report, since that standard report, however useful for many purchases, draws primarily from the same state title records that a deliberate title washing scheme is specifically designed to manipulate, while the insurance industry's own shared total loss database exists entirely independently of that process, and, in my case, was the only thing that actually revealed the true history hiding underneath a title that looked, by every ordinary measure available to a typical buyer, completely clean. Story 5. I found a hidden camera built into a smoke detector mounted inside my own bedroom, in a rental unit I'd lived in for almost a year, and once I traced who had actually installed it, it turned out to be my landlord himself, placed there before I ever moved in, which he had apparently simply never removed once I signed the lease, whether out of laziness, indifference, or something considerably worse that I still don't have full clarity on even now. I want to explain how I found it, because the discovery itself was almost entirely accidental rather than the result of any particular suspicion on my part. I was doing a deep clean of my bedroom, moving furniture around to vacuum behind things I normally never bothered to move, and needed to check the smoke detector's battery, which had been chirping intermittently for a few days. Taking it down to replace the battery, I noticed it felt heavier and more solidly constructed than a standard smoke detector should, and, on closer inspection, found a small lens and what was unmistakably a memory card slot built into the unit, positioned in a way that had nothing to do with actual smoke detection functionality. I did not touch or disturb it further once I recognized what I was looking at, instead taking photos, noting the exact position and orientation of the lens relative to my bed, and calling the non-emergency police line immediately, the same instinct I'd later learn, when researching similar situations other people had gone through, is specifically the correct one, since preserving the device undisturbed and involving law enforcement immediately rather than confronting the landlord directly first protects both the physical evidence and your own safety, given you have no way of knowing, in that first moment of discovery, who else might have access to whatever the device had been recording or transmitting. A detective came out within a couple of days, examined the device, and confirmed it was indeed a functioning covert camera disguised as a smoke detector with an active memory card that, once lawfully seized under a warrant, would need forensic examination to determine what, if anything, had actually been recorded and for how long. The investigation into who had installed it took a specific path that I found genuinely surprising once it unfolded. I had assumed, going in, that if this was intentional rather than some previous tenant's forgotten device, it was most likely connected to my landlord in some way, since he retained a key and periodic access to the unit for maintenance purposes throughout my tenancy. What the investigation actually established, through purchase records the detective was able to trace connected to the device's specific model and a receipt found during a search of records related to my landlord's broader property management business, was that he had purchased and installed the camera himself, specifically, according to the timeline established, during renovation work done to the unit roughly 2 months before I moved in, meaning it had been in place, watching that bedroom, for the entire duration of my tenancy without my knowledge, installed before I ever set foot in the apartment as a prospective tenant viewing it. I want to be honest about how disorienting and violating that specific detail felt once confirmed. The idea that this had not been some opportunistic act triggered by anything specific to me, but rather a device apparently placed as a matter of course during a renovation, meaning it may well have been intended to observe whatever eventual tenant ended up living in that specific bedroom. A genuinely chilling thought that I've had to sit with in a way that doesn't have a clean emotional resolution even now. The forensic examination of the memory card, conducted as part of the criminal investigation, confirmed that the device had, in fact, been actively recording throughout my tenancy, footage that the detectives unit reviewed only to the minimum extent necessary to establish the pattern and duration for prosecutorial purposes, with appropriate sensitivity and privacy protocols that I was genuinely grateful for during an already difficult process, since I did not want and was not required to personally review any of the actual footage myself as part of pursuing the case. My landlord was charged criminally under our state's unlawful surveillance statute, which specifically covers installing recording devices in spaces where a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy, a standard that a private bedroom in a rental unit clearly and unambiguously meets, this being about as strong a case for that expectation as exists in any residential context. Given the clear physical evidence, the confirmed installation timeline tied to his own renovation records, and the forensic confirmation of active recording throughout my actual tenancy, he ultimately pleaded guilty rather than proceed to trial, receiving a sentence that included, in our state's specific statutory framework, both a criminal penalty and mandatory registration requirements given the nature and duration of the offense. I moved out of that unit immediately once the investigation confirmed what had happened. Breaking my lease with what I want to note was very little practical resistance from the property management company that had, by that point, been forced to distance itself from my now criminally charged landlord as quickly and cleanly as possible for its own liability protection, and I did not pursue any argument about early termination penalties, given how clearly and completely this situation justified an immediate exit regardless of any technical lease terms. I pursued a separate civil claim against my landlord for damages related to the invasion of privacy and the emotional distress of learning I'd been recorded, without my knowledge, in my own bedroom for the better part of a year, a case that resulted in a judgment in my favor, though I want to be honest, as is often the case with judgments against an individual defendant rather than a well-insured corporate entity, that actual financial recovery has been slow and partial, collected gradually, through what assets and income streams could be identified and legally attached, a process my attorney described honestly from the outset as likely to take years to fully resolve, given my landlord's own financial situation once his property management business itself came apart following the criminal charges becoming public. I also, separately, made sure to notify the current tenant of that specific unit, once I learned through a mutual contact who the new occupant was, that the smoke detector in that bedroom had been previously found to contain a hidden camera, since the criminal investigation had removed and retained that specific device as evidence, but I had no independent way to confirm whether any other device might exist elsewhere in that unit, that the initial investigation, focused specifically on the device I'd found and reported, might not have comprehensively searched for. I want to be honest that I don't know whether that new tenant ever followed up on that warning or had their own independent inspection done, since I only had a second-hand connection to pass the information along at all. But I felt a real obligation to make sure that information reached them, regardless of whether I could personally confirm what they did with it. The thing I keep returning to, more than a year removed from this experience, is how completely normal and unremarkable that smoke detector looked for the entire time I lived there, mounted exactly where every smoke detector in every bedroom I'd ever lived in had always been mounted, never once triggering any suspicion because there was, genuinely, nothing about its outward appearance that differed meaningfully from an ordinary unit, right down to an actual functioning smoke detection element built in alongside the hidden camera, meaning it would have passed any basic visual inspection or even a testing of its actual smoke alarm function without ever revealing the additional hidden component built inside it. If you rent any unit, especially one where the landlord retains any kind of ongoing access for maintenance purposes throughout your tenancy, I would genuinely encourage, even though it feels excessive and even a little paranoid to suggest, periodically and physically checking any smoke detector, particularly ones that feel unusually heavy or that have any small additional lens or opening beyond the standard sensor housing that a quick look online at your specific detector model's normal appearance would show, since this specific category of hidden camera, disguised as an ordinary safety device that every rental unit is required to have installed anyway, depends entirely on the assumption that nobody ever looks closely at something that's designed, by its very nature, to blend in as mundane, expected, and completely unremarkable, and that assumption, uncomfortable as it is to actually act against in your own home, is precisely the thing that let this go undetected in my case for as long as it did. Story 6. I went to a chiropractor for ordinary lower back pain after a long car trip, and left the first visit having been told I had a severe spinal misalignment requiring an intensive treatment plan of 3 sessions a week for 6 months, prepaid upfront at a steep discount for committing to the full package. A diagnosis and treatment recommendation that a completely independent orthopedic specialist later told me had no basis in the actual imaging taken that same first visit. Imaging that showed nothing beyond ordinary, unremarkable wear, consistent with my age and the long drive that had triggered the visit in the first place. I want to walk through the actual visit itself in detail, because I think the specific choreography of how this played out matters for anyone who might encounter something similar. I came in with a straightforward complaint: lower back stiffness and mild pain after an unusually long drive. Nothing dramatic. The kind of thing most people have experienced at some point after sitting too long in a car. The chiropractor, I'll call him Dr. Nash, took x-rays as part of the initial evaluation, standard enough practice for a new patient complaint like mine. He brought me into a consultation room afterward and presented the x-rays on a large monitor, pointing out what he described as significant misalignment in my lumbar spine, along with what he called early degenerative changes that, left untreated, would likely worsen considerably over time and could lead to chronic pain and mobility issues down the road. He used a specific term, subluxation, repeatedly, describing it as a condition where vertebrae are slightly out of proper position in a way that interferes with nervous system function, requiring a structured, intensive course of adjustments to correct. The treatment plan he proposed was 3 sessions per week for 6 months, a total of just over 70 visits, priced individually at a rate that would have been extremely expensive if paid per session, but offered at a substantial discount, close to 40% off the per-session rate. If I committed to and prepaid the entire 6-month package up front, a total of just under $6,000, framed explicitly as a limited-time offer specifically for new patients who committed on their first visit, rather than shopping around or thinking it over. I want to be honest that I did feel pressured in the moment, though it took me a while afterward to articulate exactly why, given that nothing about the interaction involved raised voices or aggressive tactics. It was all calm, professional, confident, delivered by someone with actual medical credentials, pointing at actual imaging of my actual spine. I did not commit that first day, telling him I wanted to think about it, which he accepted graciously while noting the discount offer would only be available if I decided within the week. That specific detail, an artificial deadline attached to a significant financial commitment based on a diagnosis I had no independent way to verify, is what actually made me pause enough to seek a second opinion before committing any money at all, a decision I'm genuinely grateful I made, given everything that followed. I brought a copy of the X-rays, which the office provided without objection when I asked, to my regular primary care physician first, who was noticeably more measured in her assessment than Dr. Nash had been, describing what she saw as ordinary age-appropriate disc space narrowing and mild degenerative changes common in a huge percentage of adults my age, entirely consistent with normal wear rather than anything requiring an intensive structural correction program, and specifically noted that the term subluxation, as used in a chiropractic context, does not correspond to any condition that shows up as a measurable, specific finding on a standard X-ray, the way Dr. Nash's presentation had implied, describing it instead as a concept specific to chiropractic theory without an equivalent standardized diagnostic definition in mainstream medical practice. Wanting a more specialized opinion, given the specific spinal nature of the claim, I also brought the same imaging to an orthopedic specialist, who was, if anything, even more direct in his assessment, stating clearly that nothing in the imaging indicated any condition requiring 70 treatment sessions over 6 months. That ordinary lower back pain following prolonged sitting typically resolves with conservative measures like stretching, activity modification, and time, and that an intensive, prepaid, multi-month treatment package prescribed on a first visit based on standard imaging, without any trial of more conservative treatment first to assess actual response, was not consistent with any standard of care he would consider appropriate for a presentation like mine. Armed with these two independent, credentialed opinions directly contradicting the basis for Dr. Nash's proposed treatment plan, I did not commit to the package, but I also felt a real obligation to do something more than simply decline for myself and move on. Given how convincing his presentation had been, and how easily, I recognized, a different patient without the specific instinct to seek outside opinions before committing significant money might have simply paid the $6,000 trusting a credentialed professional, pointing at their own actual imaging. I filed a complaint with our state's chiropractic licensing board, providing the imaging, a description of the specific diagnosis and treatment plan presented, and copies of both independent written opinions I'd obtained, directly contradicting the basis for that plan, framing my complaint specifically around the concern that a significant, prepaid, long-term treatment commitment had been recommended based on a diagnosis that appeared, by outside review, unsupported by the actual imaging, combined with a discount structure specifically incentivizing immediate full prepayment rather than a more incremental approach that would allow reassessment based on actual treatment response. The licensing board investigation, once opened, requested Dr. Nash's patient records more broadly, not just mine, examining whether this specific diagnosis and package pricing pattern, severe subluxation requiring an extensive prepaid 6-month commitment, appeared consistently across a broad range of his new patients, regardless of their specific presenting complaint, which would suggest a standardized sales pattern rather than genuinely individualized clinical assessment, varying based on each patient's actual presentation and imaging findings. That broader records review, according to what was eventually shared with me as part of the proceeding, found a strikingly consistent pattern. A large majority of new patients across a wide range of presenting complaints, from minor stiffness like mine to more significant injuries, received a remarkably similar severe subluxation diagnosis and an extensive, expensive, prepaid multi-month treatment recommendation, a consistency that a clinical reviewer engaged by the licensing board characterized as inconsistent with genuinely individualized diagnosis and treatment planning, and considerably more consistent with a standardized sales script applied broadly regardless of each patient's actual specific presentation. The board's disciplinary proceeding, based on that pattern, combined with several other patient complaints that emerged once the investigation became known within the local patient community, Similar reviewers had apparently been quietly circulating on local review sites for months, without anyone connecting them into a formal pattern, resulted in a finding against Dr. Nash for practices inconsistent with appropriate standard of care and patient-informed consent requirements. Given that patients were not being given an accurate, individualized picture of their actual condition or reasonable, less costly conservative treatment alternatives, before being presented with an extensive prepaid commitment. The specific consequence included a formal reprimand on his permanent licensing record, mandatory additional continuing education specifically focused on informed consent and evidence-based treatment planning, and a requirement that his practice implement a new policy prohibiting full prepayment discount offers for treatment plans exceeding a certain duration or cost threshold without a mandatory reassessment and reconsent process at a defined interval, specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of lock-in, high-pressure, first-visit financial commitment that had been the actual profitable core of his prior practice model. I did not personally recover any money, since I never actually paid for the package in the first place, which I recognize puts me in a fortunate position relative to other patients who did commit and prepay before ever seeking an outside opinion, several of whom, once the pattern became public through the licensing proceeding, did pursue and in some cases successfully recover partial refunds for unused portions of prepaid packages, particularly patients who could show, similarly to my own outside opinions, that their specific diagnosis had no clear support in their actual imaging or clinical presentation. What stays with me most from this experience is how completely legitimate the entire interaction felt in the room, an actual licensed professional, actual medical imaging of my actual body, presented calmly and confidently rather than through any obviously high-pressure tactic. And how much that specific combination, real credentials plus real imaging plus a confident, unhurried presentation, can make an entirely manufactured, sales-driven diagnosis feel indistinguishable from a genuinely necessary medical recommendation to a patient with no independent clinical training of their own to compare it against. If you're ever presented with a significant, expensive, prepaid treatment package on a first visit to any kind of practitioner, chiropractic or otherwise, based on a diagnosis you have no independent way to verify, and especially if that package comes with a time-limited discount, specifically incentivizing you to commit before seeking any other opinion, treat that specific combination, urgency plus prepayment plus a diagnosis you can't independently confirm, as reason enough to pause and seek at least one outside independent assessment before committing any money at all, regardless of how credentialed and confident the person presenting the plan to you happens to be, because the confidence of the presentation, in my case at least, turned out to have very little correlation with how well supported the underlying diagnosis actually was. Story 7. My husband and I booked what we thought was a week at an all-inclusive resort for our 10th anniversary through a travel agency that a coworker had recommended after using them for her own trip the previous year, paid $4,600 in full 4 months in advance, and arrived at the actual resort to be told, at the front desk, that no reservation existed under our name, our confirmation number, or any variation of our booking reference at all, because the agency had never actually paid the resort for our stay, despite having collected full payment from us months earlier. I want to explain why we trusted this agency enough to pay in full so far in advance, since I think that detail matters for understanding how this happened despite what felt, at the time, like reasonable caution on our part. My coworker had genuinely used this same agency the year before for a trip to a different resort, had a good experience, and specifically recommended them to me with real enthusiasm, which carried more weight with me than any anonymous online review would have, since I trusted her judgment and had no reason to think her experience wasn't representative. The agency itself presented professionally, an established-looking website, a specific named agent who handled our booking personally over several email exchanges and one phone call, sending us a detailed itinerary, a specific confirmation number, and what appeared to be an actual booking confirmation email, formatted with the resort's own branding and logo, referencing our specific room category, dates, and the all-inclusive package details we'd selected. We paid the full amount through a bank transfer, which the agent explained was their standard payment method for full package bookings of this size, offering a modest discount for paying by transfer rather than credit card, framed as passing along the savings from avoiding credit card processing fees, a detail that, in hindsight, should have registered as more of a concern than it did at the time, since bank transfers offer considerably weaker consumer protection and dispute options compared to a credit card payment, precisely why scammers overwhelmingly prefer them. The 4 months between booking and our actual travel date passed without any red flags at all. We received a follow-up email about 2 months out confirming our arrival transfer arrangements, and another about 3 weeks before departure with some standard pre-arrival information about the resort, both of which felt entirely normal and expected, continuing to build our confidence that everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Arriving at the resort after a long travel day, tired and ready to finally start our anniversary trip, and being told at the front desk that no reservation existed under any information we could provide, was one of the more disorienting experiences either of us has been through. The front desk staff were, to their credit, sympathetic and clearly familiar with exactly this situation, which itself was an unsettling thing to realize, that this was common enough at their specific property that staff had an established, practiced way of handling guests arriving with no actual reservation behind a supposedly confirmed booking. The front desk manager explained, once we were able to speak with her directly, that they periodically encountered guests arriving with confirmation documents from third-party booking agencies that had never actually transmitted payment or a reservation request to the resort at all, meaning the agency had collected payment from the traveler while never actually booking or paying for the corresponding stay, a scheme that works specifically because the fraudulent confirmation documents look completely legitimate to the traveler, who has no independent way to verify the booking exists until they physically arrive and discover otherwise, generally with nowhere else lined up, and no easy way to arrange alternative accommodations on the spot in an unfamiliar location. I want to be honest about what those first few hours were like, standing in a resort lobby in a foreign country, exhausted, having just learned that $4,600 we'd paid months in advance appeared to have simply vanished into an agency's account with nothing to show for it. Needing to figure out, in real time, whether we could even afford to book a room at that same resort directly at whatever their current rate happened to be, on top of the money already lost, or whether we needed to scramble to find alternative accommodations somewhere else entirely with no advance planning at all. The resort, to their genuine credit and in a gesture I remain grateful for, offered us a significantly discounted direct rate for the remainder of our stay, given the circumstances and, I suspect, their own frustration at having their name and branding used in a scam that reflected badly on them despite having nothing to do with the actual fraud, which allowed us to salvage the trip itself, arriving considerably poorer than planned, but at least not stranded entirely. Once we were home, the actual pursuit of recovering our original payment began, and I want to walk through what worked and what didn't, because the specifics matter for anyone facing something similar. The bank transfer payment method, as I'd feared even in the moment we agreed to it, offered essentially no dispute mechanism through my bank. Unlike a credit card chargeback, a wire or bank transfer, once completed and received by the recipient's bank, generally cannot be reversed through the sending bank simply on the customer's request. Since the receiving institution has no obligation to return funds absent a court order or the receiving account holder's own voluntary cooperation, neither of which was forthcoming from an agency that had apparently taken the money and had no intention of ever delivering anything for it. I filed a police report immediately, both with our local police department and, given the interstate and international elements involved, with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, framing this specifically as travel booking fraud involving payment collected for services never rendered. I also filed a complaint with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division and, critically, with the American Society of Travel Advisors, an industry association that maintains standards and complaint processes specifically for travel agency conduct, since legitimate travel agencies operating in good faith generally maintain membership and accreditation with recognized industry bodies specifically to distinguish themselves from exactly this kind of fraudulent operation. The most useful single step, in terms of actually building toward any real accountability, turned out to be reaching out directly to the resort itself, and asking whether they had encountered other travelers with bookings through this same specific agency who'd experienced the identical situation, since if this was a pattern rather than an isolated incident specific to us, that pattern would matter enormously for any law enforcement or regulatory action. The resort's reservations manager, once I explained the situation and specifically asked this question, confirmed, somewhat carefully given her own company's liability concerns about discussing other guests' situations, that our situation was not entirely unfamiliar, phrasing that told me clearly enough that this was not our specific agency's first time doing exactly this. I posted about our experience, with as much specific detail as I could responsibly include, in a couple of larger travel planning and travel scam awareness online communities, and within about 2 weeks had been contacted by 4 other travelers describing an almost identical experience with the same agency. Different resorts, different destinations, but the same core pattern. Full payment collected months in advance via bank transfer, a professional-looking confirmation with legitimate-seeming resort branding, and an arrival to discover no actual reservation had ever been made. Combining our accounts into a single joint complaint submitted to both the FBI's fraud reporting system and our state's Attorney General office gave investigators considerably more to work with than any single traveler's isolated $4,000 loss ever would have on its own, establishing a clear pattern across multiple victims and multiple resort properties rather than what might otherwise look like a single unfortunate booking mishap. I want to be honest that, as of this writing, close to a year after this happened, we have not recovered any of our original payment, and my attorney, when I consulted one about pursuing a civil claim, was candid that recovering funds from what increasingly looked like a deliberately structured fraud operation, likely using accounts specifically designed to be difficult to trace and recover from once funds moved through them, was a genuinely uphill battle with real costs that might well exceed whatever we could realistically hope to recover even in a successful outcome. The agency's website, notably, went offline entirely about 4 months after our trip, replaced, when I checked again more recently, out of morbid curiosity, by what appears to be an entirely new agency website with different branding but, based on some of the same specific language and layout patterns other affected travelers and I compared notes on, quite possibly the same operators simply rebuilding under a new identity, a pattern apparently common enough in this specific type of fraud that our joint complaint specifically flagged this possibility for investigators to watch for. The practical lesson I took from all of this, and the thing I now do without exception for any travel booking involving prepayment, is to never pay a travel agency or booking service through a bank transfer or wire, regardless of any discount offered for doing so, using only credit cards specifically because of the dispute and chargeback protections they provide, and, separately, to independently verify any resort reservation directly with the resort itself once a confirmation number is provided, a phone call that takes a few minutes and that, had we made it even once during those 4 months of waiting, would have caught this fraud with enough time remaining to actually do something about it, rather than discovering it while standing exhausted at a front desk on the other side of the world with nowhere else to go. Story 8. I paid $11,000 for a full furnace and central air replacement from a company that showed me what looked like a completed, approved city permit, installed a system that a home inspector, brought in for an unrelated reason almost a year later, flagged as improperly vented in a way that was actively leaking carbon monoxide into my basement, and when I went back to check on that permit myself, discovered it had never actually been filed with the city at all. The document I'd been shown was fabricated. I want to walk through how I ended up choosing this company, because I did do a version of due diligence, just not the specific version that would have actually caught the problem, which I think is an important distinction for anyone reading this who assumes basic due diligence alone protects you in every situation. I got quotes from 3 companies, checked each one's general online reviews, which were reasonably positive for all 3, and selected the company I'll call Apex, based on a combination of a competitive price and a sales representative who spent real time walking me through the specific equipment being proposed, its efficiency ratings, and the installation timeline. Apex's crew completed the installation over 2 days, and at the end of the job, the lead installer showed me, on his tablet, what he described as the permit application that had been submitted to the city for the work, along with a photo, he said, of the approved permit that would be mailed to me directly once the city's final inspection was scheduled and completed. I did not push further on this at the time, since a lot of HVAC companies do handle permitting directly on the homeowner's behalf as a standard part of the service, and having a permit document shown to me, even briefly on a tablet screen rather than as something I held physically, felt like reasonable confirmation that this normal, expected step was being handled. The system worked fine, as far as I could tell in day-to-day use, heating and cooling my house effectively through an entire winter and the following summer, giving me no functional reason to think anything about the installation itself was deficient. The issue surfaced almost a year later, when I had a home inspector out for a completely unrelated reason, evaluating the house for a home equity line of credit application, part of the standard process my lender required before approving the loan. That inspector, doing a routine but thorough walkthrough of major systems, flagged the furnace venting configuration immediately as a potential concern, noting that the flue pipe connection appeared undersized relative to the furnace's actual output rating, and that the venting run included what he described as an improper horizontal offset that could allow combustion gases, including carbon monoxide, to not properly vent to the exterior under certain conditions, particularly if any blockage or backdraft situation occurred. He recommended, given the seriousness of what he was describing, an immediate professional carbon monoxide test and inspection by a licensed HVAC technician, independent of whoever had performed the original installation. I want to be honest that reading that recommendation and understanding what it actually meant, a potential ongoing carbon monoxide leak risk in my own basement for close to a year, every winter, every time that furnace had run, was one of the more frightening moments of homeownership I've experienced, made worse by the fact that I had, up until that inspection, no reason whatsoever to suspect anything was wrong with a system that had seemed to be functioning completely normally the entire time. I immediately purchased and installed additional carbon monoxide detectors beyond the single unit I already had, which thankfully had never triggered an alarm, though the inspector explained that a slow, low-level chronic leak from an improper venting configuration doesn't always trigger standard detector thresholds, the way an acute, dangerous spike would, meaning the absence of an alarm going off over the past year did not necessarily mean the situation had been entirely safe the whole time, just that it likely hadn't crossed into acutely dangerous territory yet. I brought in an independent, licensed HVAC technician, someone with no connection to Apex at all, for a full evaluation, and his findings confirmed and expanded on what the home inspector had flagged. The venting configuration did not meet current code requirements for that specific furnace model and output rating, representing a genuine, ongoing safety risk that should have been caught and corrected before the system was ever put into operation, precisely the kind of issue a legitimate municipal building inspection, tied to an actual filed permit, exists specifically to catch before a system goes live. That last point is what sent me back to actually verify the permit status directly with the city, rather than continuing to rely on what Apex had shown me on installation day. I called the city's building department directly, provided my address, and asked for the status of any HVAC or mechanical permit filed for my property over the relevant time period. Their records showed no permit had ever been filed for my address at all, for that installation or any other work during that entire year. That confirmation, that the permit I'd been shown on a tablet screen the day of installation simply did not exist in the city's own official records, was the moment this went from a serious but seemingly isolated safety and workmanship problem into something involving deliberate deception about a legally required regulatory step specifically designed to catch exactly the kind of dangerous venting error I now had confirmed I'd been living with for a year. I contacted an attorney and, separately, filed a complaint with our state's contractor licensing board, since HVAC installation is a licensed trade in most states, specifically because of exactly this kind of safety risk, and installing a system without pulling the required permit. Or worse, fabricating documentation to make a homeowner believe a permit had been filed when it hadn't, are both serious violations of licensing regulations that most state boards take considerably more seriously than an ordinary customer service complaint about workmanship quality alone. The licensing board investigation, once opened, requested Apex's own permitting records for a broader window of their business activity, not just my specific address, and found, according to what was eventually shared with me as part of the proceeding, a pattern across a meaningful number of jobs over roughly 2 years where no permit had been filed despite installation completion documents or customer communications referencing permits as handled. A pattern the investigation characterized as a systemic practice of skipping the permitting and associated municipal inspection process, specifically to save time and avoid inspection delays, rather than an isolated oversight specific to my job. That pattern mattered enormously for the licensing board's ultimate action, which included a suspension of Apex's contractor license pending a formal hearing, and, once that hearing concluded, a permanent revocation of the company's license to operate as a licensed HVAC contractor in our state, along with a requirement that the company notify all customers from the identified affected period, which included dozens of other households beyond just mine, that their installations may not have received proper permitting and inspection and should be independently evaluated for safety compliance. I want to be honest that learning dozens of other households had potentially been living with the same kind of unpermitted, uninspected installation risk, entirely without their own knowledge, was a genuinely unsettling thing to learn, even as it validated that my situation was part of a real systemic problem, rather than some unusual, isolated bad luck. For my own specific situation, I pursued a separate civil claim against Apex for the cost of properly correcting the venting issue, the cost of the independent inspections that had been required to identify and confirm the problem, and, given the deliberate fabrication of the permit documentation specifically, a claim for additional damages related to that misrepresentation rather than simply an ordinary workmanship dispute. That case settled before trial, with Apex's remaining insurance covering the cost of the corrective venting work performed by a properly licensed independent contractor, along with a payment covering my inspection costs and a portion of general damages related to the year-long undisclosed safety risk. The corrective work itself, once properly permitted and inspected this time through the city's actual process, took about 2 days, and the licensed technician doing the correction was, frankly, somewhat appalled at the original installation once he saw it fully exposed, confirming that the specific venting error was exactly the kind of thing a legitimate final city inspection, the one that never actually happened because no permit was ever filed, would have caught and required correction on before the system was ever allowed to be approved for operation. If there's a single practical lesson from this experience, it's that a permit shown to you on someone's phone or tablet screen at the end of a job is not verification, it's a claim, and the only way to actually confirm a required permit has been properly filed and, eventually, inspected and approved, is to independently contact your city or county building department directly yourself and ask for the status using your own address, a call that takes about 10 minutes, and that, had I made it within the first few weeks after my installation, rather than waiting nearly a year to have any reason to question it, would have caught a genuinely dangerous carbon monoxide venting error long before it had the chance to sit unaddressed in my basement for an entire heating season. Story 9. I helped run the competitive side of a regional esports scene for a popular team-based game for about 3 years, mostly volunteer organizing plus a small cut of entry fees for my time, and one of the other organizers I'd worked with for over a year quietly walked away with just under $31,000 in accumulated tournament entry fees and sponsor money 3 days before what was supposed to be our biggest event yet, a multi-weekend regional championship with teams who'd paid real money and taken real time off work to travel in for it. I want to explain the setup because I think a lot of people outside competitive gaming don't realize how much real money moves through amateur and semi-professional esports organizing at the regional level. Entry fees from competing teams, sponsorship deals with local gaming cafes and equipment companies, streaming platform revenue splits, all of it typically flowing through whatever informal financial arrangement a small organizing group has set up, which in our case meant a shared business bank account that 2 of us, myself and the other organizer, I'll call him Deke, had joint access to, an arrangement built entirely on trust accumulated over roughly 2 years of working together without any real formal partnership agreement or financial oversight structure at all. Deke had handled the bulk of our financial administration for most of that time, collecting entry fees through our tournament registration platform, negotiating and collecting sponsor payments, and managing the shared account, while I focused more on the actual competitive operations, bracket management, rules enforcement, communicating with team captains, a division of labor that had worked fine for 2 years without any issue I was aware of, largely because I simply never had reason to closely audit the financial side of something Deke seemed to genuinely enjoy handling, and was, by all appearances, handling competently. The championship event we were building toward represented our largest entry fee pool ever, close to 200 teams across several regional qualifying brackets feeding into a final weekend event, each team paying a modest entry fee that, aggregated across that many teams plus 3 separate sponsor payments we'd secured for the event specifically, added up to just under $31,000 sitting in our shared account as the event approached, earmarked for venue costs, prize payouts to the eventual winning teams, and streaming production expenses. 3 days before the event, Deke stopped responding to messages entirely, missed a planning call we'd scheduled specifically to finalize logistics, and, when I finally checked our shared bank account directly out of mounting alarm, found it had been drained to just under $400 through a series of transfers over the preceding 2 weeks, transfers I had never authorized or even known were happening, since I'd never had reason to check the account balance directly, trusting Deke's periodic verbal updates about where things stood financially. I want to describe the specific panic of that discovery, because it happened with an event 3 days away, dozens of teams already having booked travel and hotel rooms specifically for a weekend they believed had a real, funded prize pool and properly arranged venue and production costs behind it, meaning this wasn't simply a private financial dispute between 2 organizers. It was about to become a very public, very embarrassing collapse, affecting hundreds of people who had planned their weekend and, in many cases, spent their own money around an event I could no longer confirm we could actually deliver as promised. My first move, within about an hour of that discovery, was contacting the venue directly to confirm whether their deposit had actually been paid, since that was the single most urgent logistics question determining whether the event could happen at all in any form. The venue confirmed a deposit had been paid weeks earlier, before whatever drained the account had happened, meaning we at least still had a physical space secured, which gave me a foundation to work from, rather than needing to cancel the entire event outright with 3 days' notice to everyone involved. I made the decision, difficult but necessary, to be completely transparent with the competing teams immediately, rather than trying to quietly patch things together and hope nobody noticed, posting a direct, honest update to our community, explaining that a financial irregularity had been discovered, that I was working to determine the full scope and secure the event's remaining logistics, and that I would provide updates as I had more concrete information, a decision that, in hindsight, I think was the single most important thing I did in this entire situation, since the alternative, trying to quietly cover the gap and hope for the best, would have left me personally exposed if things had gone even worse, and would have denied the community the chance to actually help, which they very much did once they understood what had happened. Several sponsor contacts, once I reached out directly and explained the situation honestly rather than trying to hide it, agreed to have their sponsor payments, which had already been transferred before the drain occurred and were part of what was now missing, effectively reissued as in-kind support instead, one sponsor covering streaming production equipment costs directly, rather than providing cash that would need to flow through our compromised account, which recovered a meaningful portion of the immediate logistics gap without requiring any actual cash to change hands again. The prize pool itself, the money actually owed to competing teams as the event's advertised winnings, was the piece I could not simply route around through in-kind arrangements, and this is where the broader esports and gaming community, once they understood what had happened, stepped in a way that genuinely moved me. Several teams and individual community members who were not even competing in the event organized an emergency crowdfunding effort specifically to help cover the gap in the promised prize pool, not out of any obligation, purely out of wanting to see an event they cared about actually happen fairly for the teams who'd already invested real time and money preparing for it. That crowdfunding effort, combined with the recovered sponsor arrangements, ultimately covered enough of the gap that the event proceeded largely as originally planned, delayed by about 6 hours on the first day to finalize last-minute logistics but otherwise intact, a genuinely remarkable outcome given where things stood 3 days earlier. Once the event itself was handled, I turned to actually pursuing Deke and the missing money, which is a considerably less dramatic and more procedurally slow story than the event rescue itself. I filed a police report immediately once the drain was confirmed, specifically framing it as theft or embezzlement from a shared business account, and consulted an attorney regarding what our actual legal standing was given that we'd never formalized any real partnership agreement, a gap that, my attorney explained, did not prevent legal action but did make the situation somewhat messier than it would have been with a clear, written partnership structure defining each person's authority and obligations regarding shared funds. The bank, once I reported the situation and requested transaction records for the account, was able to identify the destination accounts the transfers had gone to, which our attorney then used to pursue a civil claim against Deke directly, framed around unauthorized withdrawal of jointly held business funds and breach of the informal fiduciary understanding that had governed how we'd operated the account for 2 years. Even without a formal written agreement specifically addressing this scenario, since courts can and do recognize implied partnership obligations based on a consistent pattern of conduct over time, even absent a signed document explicitly laying out every term. That civil case resulted in a judgment against Deke for the full missing amount, though I want to be honest that actually collecting on that judgment has been a slow, ongoing process, since Deke, once confronted with the legal action, did not have anything close to $31,000 in readily available assets, meaning recovery has come gradually through a structured payment arrangement and, more recently, wage garnishment once we located his current employment, a process that, as of this writing, has recovered a little over half of the original amount, with the remainder still being paid down slowly. The broader regional esports community, once the full story became known, effectively closed ranks against Deke in a way that felt, honestly, like its own form of consequence beyond the legal proceedings, since competitive gaming communities, even at a regional amateur level, are smaller and more tightly networked than people outside them often realize, and word of exactly what happened spread quickly enough that Deke has not, as far as I'm aware, been involved in organizing any competitive event in our region, or any adjacent one since. A reputation consequence that, in a hobby built almost entirely on trust between organizers who mostly know each other personally, functions as a genuinely significant and lasting penalty. We restructured our organizing group's entire financial process after this. Formal written agreements between all organizers now, a requirement that any single transfer above a modest threshold requires 2-person sign-off rather than 1 person having unilateral account access, and a rule that any organizer, myself included, can request a full account statement at any time, without it being treated as some kind of accusation or breach of trust. A cultural shift that took real, deliberate effort to establish, given how much our entire community had operated for years on an assumption of good faith that, for 2 years with Deke specifically, had genuinely been earned and deserved right up until the moment it very much wasn't. If you're involved in organizing anything, a gaming tournament, a community event, any hobby group where real money flows through a shared account managed informally between friends or acquaintances you trust, I'd encourage building in that 2-person sign-off requirement and that no questions asked right to request a full statement from the very beginning, regardless of how solid the trust currently feels. Because the actual lesson from this entire experience is not that Deke was uniquely deceptive from day one, it's that a financial structure built entirely on one person's unilateral access and everyone else's ongoing trust will eventually be tested by something, a personal financial crisis, an opportunity that feels too easy to resist, and having a structural safeguard in place before that test ever comes matters far more than how much you currently trust the specific person holding the keys. Story 10. I run a small landscaping business, and I paid a digital marketing agency $2,200 a month for 8 months, close to $18,000 total, before I discovered that almost none of the work they claimed to be doing on my behalf had actually happened, and that the glowing monthly performance reports I'd been receiving were, as far as I could ever establish, largely fabricated. I want to explain how I got into this arrangement. because I think it's worth being honest that I was not a naive first-time business owner falling for an obviously sketchy pitch. I'd run my business successfully for 9 years before this happened, and the agency's initial sales process was genuinely professional and specific. A real website, case studies referencing actual, checkable client names in adjacent but non-competing service industries, and a sales representative who spent real time understanding my specific business before proposing a package rather than just pitching a generic template. The service itself was described as comprehensive digital marketing management, search engine optimization work on my website, monthly content creation for my blog and social media, paid advertising campaign management, and monthly reporting showing the specific results of all of it. Website traffic growth, lead generation numbers, ad performance metrics, the kind of comprehensive package that, if actually delivered, would genuinely have been worth the price for a small business like mine trying to compete against larger, better resourced landscaping companies in my area. For the first 2 or 3 months, I want to be fair and say things felt reasonably legitimate. A few blog posts did appear on my website, a handful of social media posts went up, and the monthly report I received showed modest but plausible growth numbers. Nothing dramatic, but nothing that immediately triggered suspicion either, which I think is actually part of why this took as long as it did to unravel, since a scam promising overnight dramatic results might have triggered skepticism faster than one that presented modest, believable-seeming progress month after month. The thing that actually made me start looking closer happened around month 5, when I mentioned to a fellow small business owner, someone in an unrelated industry who used a different marketing agency, that my own results felt underwhelming relative to the reported numbers, since I wasn't seeing any noticeable uptick in actual customer inquiries, despite the reports showing steadily increasing website traffic and lead generation. She asked, reasonably, whether I had my own independent analytics access to verify those numbers directly, rather than relying entirely on the agency's own reporting, a question that made me realize, somewhat embarrassingly, that I did not. I'd simply been receiving their monthly PDF reports and taking the figures at face value without ever independently verifying them through my own website's actual analytics platform. I logged into my own website's analytics account directly, which I did technically have access to, but had genuinely never checked myself in any detail, trusting the agency's reporting entirely, and the numbers I found there were dramatically, unmistakably lower than what had been reported to me every single month. Where the agency's reports showed steadily climbing monthly website visits, reaching, by month 5, a claimed figure several times higher than my actual baseline before hiring them, my own analytics platform showed traffic that had barely moved at all from before I ever engaged their services, a gap far too large to be explained by any reasonable difference in measurement methodology or reporting timeframe. I also checked my blog directly and found that of the 12 monthly posts I'd been billed for and told had been published over those 5 months, only 4 actually existed live on my website, meaning 8 months of invoiced content work, at a specific line item cost within my monthly retainer, had simply never been delivered at all, despite being reported as complete in every monthly summary I'd received. The paid advertising component was, if anything, worse once I dug into it. I requested direct access to the actual advertising platform account being used to run my supposed campaigns, something I should have insisted on from day one but hadn't, trusting the agency's own reporting instead, and found that while an account did exist and had received some of my monthly ad spend budget, the actual campaigns configured within it were minimal, poorly targeted in ways that suggested little real strategic effort, and had generated a small fraction of the click and lead volume the monthly reports claimed, meaning a meaningful portion of my advertising budget appeared to have simply never been spent on actual advertising at all, raising the obvious question of where exactly that portion of my payment had actually gone. I confronted the agency directly with these specific discrepancies, requesting a detailed explanation and full access to all underlying platform accounts, rather than just their own summary reports going forward. Their response was defensive and vague, citing reporting methodology differences and attribution complexities, without ever providing a coherent explanation for how 8 of 12 promised blog posts simply didn't exist, or how ad spend I'd paid for didn't correspond to actual campaign activity in the platform itself. I terminated the contract immediately and began the process of trying to recover what I now believed was money paid for services that were substantially never delivered. My first step was disputing the most recent charges directly through my credit card company, since I'd been paying the monthly retainer by card, citing services not rendered as the basis for the dispute, and providing the specific analytics discrepancies and missing blog post evidence as documentation. Credit card disputes for services not rendered do have a real, if not unlimited, window in which they can typically be filed, usually measured in months rather than years from the specific charge date, meaning I was able to successfully recover the 3 most recent months of payments through that process, but not the earlier months that fell outside my card's dispute filing window. For the earlier months, recovering that money required a more direct approach. I consulted a business attorney regarding what my actual legal options were, and she confirmed that what I was describing, specifically the pattern of fabricated reporting claiming work had been completed that demonstrably had not been, went well beyond an ordinary dissatisfaction with marketing results, which would generally not be independently actionable since marketing outcomes are inherently variable and no reasonable service contract guarantees specific results. Fabricated performance reporting claiming specific deliverables were completed when they provably were not, however, constitutes a much stronger claim, essentially a breach of contract, combined with what could reasonably be characterized as fraudulent misrepresentation regarding services actually rendered. My attorney sent a formal demand letter to the agency, laying out the specific discrepancies with the same documentation I'd compiled: the missing blog posts, the analytics gap, the underutilized ad spend, and demanding a refund for the specific months where services were demonstrably not delivered as reported and invoiced. The agency's own attorney responded initially with a fairly boilerplate denial, but the specificity of our documentation, actual screenshots of my own analytics platform showing the real traffic numbers alongside their reported numbers for the same exact months, side by side, made their position difficult to sustain credibly if this had proceeded to actual litigation, since a judge or arbitrator reviewing that side-by-side comparison would have very little difficulty understanding what had actually happened. The case settled before any formal litigation, with the agency agreeing to refund 4 of the 8 disputed months, a partial rather than complete recovery that my attorney characterized as a reasonably favorable outcome given the practical costs and time that full litigation would have required relative to the total amount in dispute, a calculation I understood and accepted even though it left me having still absorbed a real loss for the remaining months. I separately filed a complaint with our state's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division and with the Better Business Bureau, specifically documenting the fabricated reporting pattern, both to create a public record for other small business owners considering this agency, and because I'd learned, through a small business owner forum where I eventually posted about my experience, that at least 3 other business owners had strikingly similar stories involving the same agency, fabricated monthly reports, underdelivered content, and underutilized ad spend, a pattern that, once several of us compared notes and combined our complaints, gave the State Consumer Protection Office considerably more to work with than any single business owner's isolated dispute would have provided on its own. I don't know the full outcome of that broader regulatory attention, since these investigations move slowly and don't always share detailed updates with individual complainants. But the agency's public online reviews shifted noticeably over the following year, with several other small business owners posting increasingly specific, similar complaints, eventually reaching a critical mass that appears to have significantly damaged their ability to continue acquiring new clients through their previously polished marketing presence. The lesson I took from this, and the thing I now do with any vendor relationship involving ongoing recurring payments for services I can't easily observe directly myself, is to insist, from day one rather than months into a relationship, on direct independent access to whatever underlying platform or account the work is actually being performed in, my own website analytics, my own advertising platform account, rather than relying entirely on a vendor's own summarized reporting, however professional and detailed that reporting appears on its face. A monthly PDF report, however polished, is simply a claim, And the only way to actually verify that claim is to check the underlying source it's supposedly summarizing yourself, something I now do every single month for every vendor relationship I have. A habit that costs me maybe 20 minutes, and that would have caught this specific fraud within the very first month, rather than 5 months and roughly $11,000 into it. Story 11. My dog needed an $11,000 emergency surgery for a twisted stomach, a condition that kills dogs within hours if untreated, and the pet insurance policy I'd paid premiums on faithfully for 3 years denied the entire claim, citing a pre-existing condition that, according to my own vet's complete medical records, had never actually been diagnosed, mentioned, or treated at any point before that emergency night. A denial that took a genuinely absurd amount of persistence to overturn. My dog, a 7-year-old Labrador mix named Otis, developed what the emergency vet immediately recognized as gastric dilatation volvulus, commonly called bloat, a condition where the stomach fills with gas and twists on itself, cutting off blood supply, requiring emergency surgery within a narrow window to have any real chance of survival. I authorized the surgery on the spot, obviously, without a second thought about cost, because the alternative was losing him within hours, and dealt with the financial reality only after he was safely out of surgery and recovering. I'd had a pet insurance policy for Otis for just over 3 years at that point, chosen specifically, in part, because it advertised coverage for exactly this kind of emergency surgical event, and I submitted the claim expecting, based on years of paid premiums and a policy document I'd read carefully when I first signed up, a substantial reimbursement covering the bulk of that $11,000. The denial letter, when it arrived about 3 weeks later, cited a pre-existing condition exclusion, stating that Otis had a documented history of gastrointestinal issues predating the policy's coverage period, and that the emergency surgery was therefore excluded as related to a pre-existing condition rather than a new, covered event. I remember reading that letter with genuine confusion rather than immediate anger, because I could not think of any gastrointestinal issue Otis had ever had, and I'd been present at every single one of his vet visits for his entire life. I requested Otis's complete medical records directly from my veterinarian, going back to when he was a puppy, specifically to understand what the insurance company was referencing, since their denial letter cited only a vague summary rather than a specific date or diagnosis. What I found, going through those complete records myself line by line, was that Otis had, once, about 4 years earlier, before I even had this specific insurance policy, been brought in for a single episode of mild vomiting after getting into some garbage on a walk, a genuinely unremarkable, one-time incident that resolved with basic supportive care within a day and was never diagnosed as any kind of chronic or structural gastrointestinal condition at all, simply logged in his chart as an isolated instance of dietary indiscretion, the actual clinical term for a dog eating something they shouldn't have. That single, resolved, 4-year-old episode was, as far as I could determine, the only possible basis for the insurance company's claimed pre-existing condition, and the gap between what actually happened, a one-time stomach upset from eating garbage, and what the denial letter implied, an ongoing gastrointestinal history connected to a life-threatening stomach-twisting emergency years later, was, once I laid it out clearly, enormous, and, frankly, medically nonsensical, since dietary indiscretion and gastric dilatation volvulus are entirely different conditions, with no established medical connection between them at all. I brought this discrepancy to my veterinarian directly, and she was, notably, willing to put this in writing clearly and specifically, which mattered enormously for what came next. She provided a formal letter stating unambiguously that Otis's historical vomiting episode was an isolated incident of dietary indiscretion with no diagnosed underlying gastrointestinal disease, that it had fully resolved without any ongoing treatment or monitoring, and that, in her professional veterinary opinion, there was no clinical connection whatsoever between that historical episode and the entirely separate, acute condition of gastric dilatation volvulus that caused the emergency surgery years later. I submitted a formal appeal to the insurance company, including that veterinary letter, along with the complete medical record excerpt showing the actual, full context of the historical episode rather than whatever abbreviated summary their claims reviewer had apparently relied on, and received, about a month later, a second denial, this one citing the same pre-existing condition exclusion, but now adding language suggesting that any prior gastrointestinal symptom, regardless of specific diagnosis, fell within their policy's broad pre-existing condition definition, an interpretation that, once I actually reread my own policy document carefully for the first time in years, did not seem to be supported by the actual written exclusion language, which specifically referenced pre-existing conditions as ones involving a diagnosed illness or disease process, a considerably narrower standard than any prior instance of vomiting for any reason at any point in the dog's life. This is where I stopped handling the appeal informally and brought in real outside help, specifically a public adjuster and, separately, a consumer attorney who had handled pet insurance disputes before, since I'd learned by that point that pet insurance, unlike health insurance, is regulated in most states as a form of property and casualty insurance rather than health insurance, meaning it falls under state insurance department oversight with actual bad faith insurance practice standards that can apply when an insurer denies a legitimate claim using an unreasonably broad or unsupported interpretation of policy language. My attorney's approach centered on filing a formal complaint with our state's Department of Insurance, specifically arguing that the insurer's denial reflected an unreasonably expansive interpretation of the pre-existing condition exclusion that contradicted the plain language of their own policy document, supported by both the complete medical record and my veterinarian's specific written clinical opinion distinguishing the historical dietary incident from the emergency surgical condition. State insurance departments generally have real authority to review individual claim denials for compliance with both the specific policy language and broader unfair claims practices regulations that most states have on the books, specifically prohibiting insurers from denying claims based on unreasonable or unsupported interpretations of ambiguous policy terms. The insurance department's review took about 10 weeks, during which they formally requested the insurer's own internal claims review documentation, including whatever clinical basis their claims reviewer had actually used to connect the historical dietary incident to the gastric dilatation volvulus diagnosis. That internal documentation, once the department obtained it and shared relevant portions during the review process, showed that the claim had been denied by an automated review system that flagged any historical record containing the word vomiting as a potential pre-existing gastrointestinal condition, without any actual veterinary clinical review of whether the historical incident and the current condition were medically related at all, meaning the denial had been generated through what was, functionally, a keyword search rather than any genuine clinical assessment. That finding, an automated keyword-based denial with no actual clinical review connecting the two conditions, is exactly the kind of practice state insurance bad faith regulations are designed to catch, since insurers are generally required to conduct a reasonable, good faith investigation before denying a claim, not simply flag any tangentially related word in a medical history and deny automatically without further clinical evaluation. The insurance department issued a finding directing the insurer to reprocess the claim using an actual clinical review standard consistent with their own policy language, rather than the automated keyword approach that had generated the original denial. Under that directed reprocessing, with an actual veterinary claims reviewer this time examining the specific clinical distinction my own vet had already laid out in writing, the claim was approved, reimbursing the covered percentage of the surgery cost under my policy's normal terms, which came to just over $7,000 once the standard deductible and coverage percentage were applied, a meaningful recovery after what had initially been a flat, total denial. I also filed a broader complaint, separate from my individual claim dispute, flagging the automated keyword-based denial practice itself as a systemic issue likely affecting other policyholders beyond just my own claim. Since if my dog's claim was denied through a keyword match against a single word in a medical record without clinical review, it seemed extremely likely this was a standard practice affecting a much larger number of claims across the insurer's full customer base, not an isolated processing error specific to my case. I don't know the full scope of any broader regulatory action that complaint may have contributed to, since insurance departments generally don't share detailed information about systemic practice reviews with individual complainants. But I did later find, through a pet owner advocacy forum, several other policyholders with the same insurer describing strikingly similar experiences, automated pre-existing condition denials based on minor, unrelated historical symptoms, several of whom successfully overturned their own denials once I shared what had worked for me and encouraged them to specifically request their insurer's internal claims review documentation and file their own state insurance department complaints. Otis made a full recovery and is, as I write this, an extremely happy, if slightly food-obsessed, older dog who has thankfully had no further gastrointestinal emergencies of any kind since. The financial recovery mattered enormously, but honestly, what stays with me most is how completely automated and disconnected from any actual clinical judgment the initial denial process turned out to be, a keyword flag rather than any human veterinary reviewer actually looking at whether a 4-year-old episode of eating garbage on a walk had any plausible medical connection to a life-threatening stomach-twisting emergency years later. If you ever have a pet insurance claim denied for a pre-existing condition, I'd strongly encourage getting your pet's complete medical records directly from your own veterinarian, rather than relying on the insurer's summary of what that history supposedly shows, and specifically asking your vet for a written clinical opinion, addressing whether any historical incident cited in the denial is actually medically connected to the current condition. Since that specific written clinical distinction, more than anything else in my entire dispute, was what ultimately forced an actual human, clinically informed review of a claim that had otherwise been denied by what amounted to an algorithm matching a single word in a years-old medical chart.